It's the Abba podcast. Let's go. And we're joined on the podcast once again with a special guest, a friend of the show, Professor Tim Anderson. Tim, how are we, mate?
Very well, thanks, Abbas. How are you?
Not too bad, man. How's things been since the last time you come on? What have you been up to?
Well, we're all a little bit trapped here, aren't we? We've got enough freedom in the city here, but we can't get out of the country. So, but apart from that, and apart from being flooded the last week, the sun's shining again today, so I can't complain.
Man, talk to us about the floods. I'm bloody going through house renos, and geez, it came at a time where I didn't really want it.
Was your roof off?
Oh yeah, the roof, everything's exposed, man, and I just want to forget it. I've come on here to forget it. So, talk to us.
Roofs are very important.
Yeah, tell me about it, man. Construction, I'm an absolute novice, and I'm starting to see how dodgy the industry is. It's just as dodgy as the international scene. So the news that's broken recently, the Morrison government is drowning in smut, rape, and cover-up, as Scott Morrison has acknowledged the terrible mistreatment of women, referencing the culture that's been embedded in Australia. Tim, what's your say on what's going on and how it's playing out in the news?
Well, I have to admit, I'm not following this so closely, but of course it reflects a culture that's here in this country. And let's remember, we'll go back a little bit. We've got that High Court judge who was exposed over multiple harassment, but covered up. And this is the thing about the level at which these sexual assault accusations are happening. They're being covered up. And I think that's one of the main thing that's arising from the Brittany Higgins case, isn't it? That on the one hand, it's a date rape which may never have, or if you believe all the allegations, is date rape which might never have gone to the court. But because it's being covered up by a political culture and the minister's office and then misleading information by the Prime Minister, it's become a much bigger issue, basically. And then, of course, the Christian Porter thing. Again, this might not have been such a big issue, except that it applies to the first law officer who himself is involved in a whole lot of dodgy dealings and unfair prosecutions against people, not least the one against Bernard Collery and Witness K and the Timor case, where the Australian government was spying on the Timorese and their lawyers and then decided to take some sort of revenge by launching charges. The David Mcbride case, which is a very important one, because in this case, 4 months after an official inquiry which revealed no less than 39 murders of Afghan civilians by Australian soldiers, the only person that's charged is the key whistleblower in the case, basically. And meantime, behind the scenes, not only are soldiers not being charged who were implicated, but the internal whistleblowers, in other words, the ones who didn't break the rules but simply spoke to the internal review, those people are being kicked out of the army too. Specifically against what Judge Brereton was saying, that their careers should not be seen to suffer for telling the truth there. So here's a situation which links into the multiple, at least 7 wars in the Middle East of the last 2 decades that this government has been involved in. And I'm including people involved in the scandal that's sweeping the government about sexual assault and the cover-up of sexual assault too. These are people who have covered up the massacre of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, covered it up directly. Maurice Payne, the entire cabinet really, and this Christian Porter, who has been accused of very old sexual assault allegations, he is the one that is leading the prosecution against some of these people, and also the chief legal advisor to the Defence Department as they fail in the mandate that they were handed to prosecute war crimes, and also when they're proceeding to expunge the people that broke the code of silence in the Australian military there. These things to me, I'm going on about this a bit because these things to me have a lot more weight. As bad as you think a sexual assault against someone is in a minister's office, I think it's the cover-up that has more weight there. And when you see it's coming from a political culture which is involved in far more serious crimes. One I've written about in Syria was the role of the Australian Air Force in murdering over 120 Syrian soldiers in Deir ez-Zor, specifically to support ISIS or Daesh, for them to take over the mountain behind Deir ez-Zor. This was the office of the then Defence Minister Maurice Payne that was involved in selling that lie to the public, and the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. So these are people deeply involved in very serious criminal cover-ups. And now the one thing that the media feels better able to talk about is the way in which particular individual young women here have been faced that sort of wrath. But I don't think we should ever forget the more serious war crimes that these very same people are involved in as we speak.
Yeah, look, I agree, and I share the sentiment that you're saying. And I was going to link that and bring up that once we spoke about the culture, because it's by no surprise that they have done and continuously do things and cover it up and go hard on whistleblowers. Because I want to ask you, with whistleblowers, the importance of whistleblowers is that they come out and say the truth. Now, the powers that be are deterring them by handing out harsh penalties and unfair judgments in court proceedings, and they're not receiving their due rights. Talk to us about whistleblowers and how the fight against the culture is against whistleblowers. Tell us about that a bit.
Well, the antagonism to whistleblowers is because these are states, and I'm starting to talk a little more broadly here. The Australian state, which is a key subordinate collaborator with Washington in all of these wars I've mentioned. Those states that are involved in deep criminal activity and conspiratorial criminal activity, because these are not openly declared wars. They are dirty wars where proxy armies are being used, where things are being covered up. They massacre the Syrian soldiers and they say, oh, it was a mistake. It was a mistake. But they continue with the same propaganda and the same war, the same with Yemen and so on. Now, in that context, someone comes along, let's say in the US, Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, right? The key whistleblower in the US military at that time. So Chelsea Manning leaks this a range of documents. WikiLeaks get their hands on it. Remember that one of the key things that Manning released was video of the US helicopter machine gunning people in Iraq, unarmed people in Iraq. Horrific war crime made public. And who do they come down the heaviest against? Initially, it's Chelsea Manning, basically, and she does 7 years jail. Now she's still facing all sorts of problems there. The main journalistic side of things that publicised that, of course, was Julian Assange in WikiLeaks. And and we know that Julian Assange has been held in jail or effectively locked up for a decade now. The Australian government's not lifting a finger to help him. He's not even facing any charges at the moment, but facing extradition to the US, and the British courts have refused to extradite him, but the British courts keep him in jail. So he is the journalistic side of these things. If we look at our version of it more recently here, we've got David Mcbride, who is the Manning equivalent here, in the sense that he, as an army officer, a lawyer, an army officer, was very upset with the crimes that he seen in Afghanistan, and he eventually leaked that to some media. Indeed, the federal police were considering charges against some of those media. I think one of them is called Daniel Oakes and others, and they would have been the Julian Assange equivalent in this parallel with the Afghan war crimes. The AFP decided not to proceed, for their own reasons, not to proceed with crimes there. But Christian Porter, the Attorney General, who is involved in a range of political cases, is the one that is trying to pursue the David Mcbride case, which I think is an extremely important case we should be paying a lot more attention to. Christian Porter's the one that is involved in that. He said to the public, oh, the government can't get involved in this case. And if you look at the media, you'll see the media saying, oh, the government says we can't get involved in this case. In fact, Christian Porter has made the government very deeply involved in this. He has made his Office of Attorney General a formal party to the case against David Mcbride, trying to get a secret trial for Mcbride, on some bogus security grounds and so on. And not recognising the great service that David Mcbride did to the public by bringing these crimes to light and effectively catalysing that official Brereton report, which was shocking, but the government is trying to bury it at the moment. So in that case, David Mcbride is facing years in jail now for doing the right thing and exposing the crimes being carried out. And this is something that was anticipated in legislation. There is some whistleblowers legislation at a federal level, but it's a pretty hard test to meet. And the first stage in court of David's case is going to be trying to invoke that defence, you know, that basically your employer or the government was about to commit crimes and you were entitled to do something to prevent those crimes. Now, David Mcbride has a very good case here, but the courts are very conservative, if not reactionary, when it comes to these sorts of things, and they tend to favour authority, so, or what they see as lawful authority. So I think there must be some doubts as to how far David's going to get with that. But as I said, this is the one person, the main whistleblower over just some of the war crimes that Australia committed in just one of its Middle East wars in the last 20 years. And the only person they're going against is Mcbride, the person that did the right thing. I think this is a huge scandal, and the people who are now facing all sorts of other scandals the public should be aware that these are very grave crimes that are being committed against our own whistleblowers here. Julian Assange being more or less just the messenger of a whistleblower, but David Mcbride being our own whistleblower. You know, all the soldiers that go into the Australian Army and fight in other countries, and usually they're fighting in other countries, they're not defending our country. But they have this impression that they're going to be regarded as heroes and come back from Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or wherever it is and be regarded as heroes. And they're very upset about this Brereton report, about the Afghan war crimes being exposed. Apparently there's been quite a number of suicides amongst soldiers there, and so they have their own spin on it. But from the point of view of the Australian public, we should be taking very seriously these reports like the Brereton report, like the revelations of David Mcbride, of the war crimes that are being committed in our name, using the name of the Australian Defence Forces, using the name of the government. And like I said, these are the same people that are now, well, I think it's largely because the media says, this is the corporate media, let's say, the colonial media, I tend to say, that they say these sexual assaults are permissible areas to discuss. These are permissible scandals, you know. The murder of 126 Syrian soldiers to support ISIS terrorists is not a permissible scandal to go on with. The date rape of a young drunk woman in a Liberal MP's office, that's permissible because it's not cutting across the key agendas of this government. But let's not let them escape from that sort of scrutiny.
Yeah, look, and scrutiny indeed it needs, because Scott Morrison's come under fire, and he basically is starting to show a tendency that I feel Donald Trump shows. When he's under pressure, he gets angry, he denies certain things, attacks the questioner, and then becomes a compulsive liar and denies things or fabricates things or possibly knows things that aren't being reported. Now, the question here for you, Tim, is what is the difference between the Morris government and the governments of America that are attacking overseas? Then if we're to put it into context of colonial Australia in colonisation, have we evolved, or are we doing the same crimes that were done in yesteryear, abusing women and invading other people's countries?
Yeah, first of all, I think you're right to draw attention to the fact that Morrison, who in the first instance wasn't really implicated in this, say, the Brittany Higgins case at all, has dug a hole for himself because he is simply concerned with saving face for his government. You know, in the meantime, the two of the ministers are off on mental health leave or some such thing because they've been exposed in wrongdoing, effectively. But Morrison, it's true, has made things worse by, first of all, I think, as far as I understand, and as I said, I don't follow every detail of this, first of all, he claimed that the person dismissed, the alleged perpetrator in the Brittany Higgins case, was dismissed for a security breach. Now it emerges there was no security breach at all, basically. They knew the full story. from the beginning. There was no security breach. The security guard has told us that those two people were authorised to go back in late at night to the parliamentary office. Then he apparently has also covered up the information that he got from the head of the Prime Minister's department. So, as I said, this is like a snowballing scandal for Morrison, which is ending up more to do with his dishonesty than the particular incident that it begins with, basically. But it's a type of, in some ways, you make this comparison with the United States. There are parallels there because they are both states and governments involved in very serious crimes, and they're accustomed to the culture of lying, fabricating evidence, fabricating pretext to escape from the ugly consequences of their crimes. But there is a difference, I would say, because the Australian state, in many respects, in living memory, certainly in my living memory, is a very derivative state. It was a creature of Britain. We never really had a struggle for independence in this country. It happened gradually in a sort of way, and then there was a rupture in the 1940s during the Second World War when the dependence on Britain, my father went to war with the 2nd AIF, the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, to defend the British Empire in 1939. It wasn't a question of an Australian policy decision. Our country was subject to our defence, so they weren't called defence forces, they were called the Australian Imperial Forces. They went to Europe in the Second World War to defend the British Empire there. Now, since that time, they were rebadged as the Australian Defence Forces. But during the Second World War, when the British abandoned Singapore and the Japanese took over, Australia switched its allegiance to the US, and then we had a series of arrangements like the 1951 ANZUS Treaty and so on, where successive Australian governments looked to the United States as the big brother, the protector. And then we get dragged into the US ambitions to take over the entire Korean Peninsula, at the beginning of the Cold War, to try and be a hedge against Stalin and the Soviet Union at that time. And then the Vietnam War to try and maintain a puppet regime in Vietnam against the so-called communist threat and what they called in the 60s the Yellow Peril, supposing that communist China was behind communist Vietnam. So a series of imperial wars, effectively, the insurgency in Malaysia, then the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, supporting the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the various proxy wars that Australian armed forces have been involved in, particularly in Iraq and Syria. So those decisions were all taken in Washington. If you go, and I've done this myself, if you go and talk to senior officials, ministers in Latin America and the Middle East, independent countries I'm talking about, they will say they don't take what Australian foreign ministers say seriously because they know they're getting directions from Washington. It's a derivative government. They take their orders in that way. There are some exceptions within the region, within the Pacific region, I'll grant. But when it comes to the Middle East, for example, and when it comes to a wider range of policies, Australian governments, particularly the conservative ones, but also the Labor ones, look for the lead from Washington. If it's not there, they'll look to London. In other words, they will try and get direction, even when our practice is better. And I say this advisedly because, the way in which the whole coronavirus thing has been handled has ended up much better here than in Britain and the US, where they've mismanaged it extremely badly and had very large numbers of deaths, hundreds of thousands of deaths. And yet the Morrison government here still doesn't really have a plan on how to deal with getting out of this situation, the control of COVID situation, because they're accustomed to looking to Washington and looking to London, and those regimes have been hopeless, basically. They should have been looking to China, but they can't look at China for anything. They haven't been talking about the Chinese vaccine or the Russian vaccine. Even conservative right-wing governments in Latin America are using the Chinese vaccine and the Russian vaccine, but the Morrison government has only looked to the British and the US vaccines. So a whole lot of things there are these invisible lines, things that are prohibited to governments in Canberra from looking outside the box because they fear they're going to be disciplined by their big brothers, basically. So the end result is you don't have a government in Canberra, particularly the Conservatives, who is capable of taking initiatives. They're always looking for the lead. So they'll look for the lead I'm talking about international matters here, basically, but it's a sort of a disease that goes through to the point where, as I said, with COVID policy, they don't really know which way to jump. They want to get a lead from someone else. When it comes to vaccines, they'll stick with the safe things, even if they're more expensive, even if they're not as good. They will stick with the American or the British ones. It's a post-colonial hangover, you know, that they are still dependent in that sort of way, and they don't really think as independent people. And it's invisible because, in a sense, both major parties are subject to it. So I think we can't really, although there are some parallels with the cover-up culture and, you know, the persecution of whistleblowers and so on, you could say, between the US and Britain and Australia. But Australia, in some respects, is worse, even if our public health system has made our epidemic situation better. It's worse at a political level because it is such a derivative political culture that is embedded in Canberra.
So basically, what's the way out now? So the Morrison government is under scrutiny with these allegations. How do you foresee the future and how they will deal with such incidents? Do you think it gets swept under the table and we move on? Or do people like Christian Porter have to be held accountable? And is his position in office safe, or does he have to go?
Look, I've been talking about the war a lot. I don't want to trivialize the culture of sexual assault and the cover-up of sexual assault. As I said, there are many aspects to it. It's not just about Brittany Higgins. It's not just about the woman who died in the Christian Porter case, 30 years old. There's the Dyson Hayden case. There's a number of other allegations that have come up about things in Parliament. And there is definitely a culture of not wanting to deal with these problems. You know, they really are people who get into a position where they think they're invulnerable and they think in very narrow, selfish terms about themselves, about their parties, and they will cover up to deal with it. But having said that, you know, I think that it's not such a big deal for the system, that system to deal with if they can have some sacrificial lambs, you know. Maybe a minister's going to resign. Maybe they're going to pay someone a lot of money. These things may well be important in terms of individual justice, but if you were talking about addressing this culture of cover-up, the culture of criminality, and the toxic media that feeds on it, I mean, one of the things that makes me somewhat cynical about the sexual assault cover-up stuff is that it's a very acceptable scandal for the corporate media to deal with, but the corporate media in so many other respects are blocking important issues to us. They are the agenda makers. They are the gatekeepers of what can be discussed. People find it's very acceptable to talk about, gender identity and racial identity and things that seem non-threatening to that corporate media. But that corporate media is at the root of this culture we're talking about, at the root of an elite culture that really will come down on whistleblowers, that really doesn't want people to talk about wars and privatizations and the systemic structural corruption embedded in our system and the culture of cover-up. So, if the media says this is a valuable thing to distract us all and we'll end up with a solution and justice will be served at the end, I'm sorry, I'm not going to buy that, because they are key to the architecture of these sorts of systems of cover-up. And who was it that covered up the war crimes in the last 7 wars in the Middle East, if not the corporate media? Now, if they're able to run sexual assault scandals on the front page, it tells me, well, these are things that are not so threatening to them. These are things that they may find within the bounds of public debate that they themselves set. So I'm sorry if that sounds to trivialize the sexual assault cases, but I think that we can't really let the corporate media get away with defining the things that are important in our lives.
Yeah, look, see, I share, if anything, the same sentiment. Again, I'll say that I am in line with what you're saying. But also, see, where I feel that the corporate media now shoot themselves in the foot, right? They openly come out and say that these cases, we have been guilty of sexualizing and using women for certain things and so on and so forth. And, basically not adhering to women's rights as they have so much, pushed for years and years and years. For me, it's internationally, they push the agenda that women are oppressed in other nations and women don't have rights and women don't have the rights to education, so on and so forth. Then when you see the Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too movement in America, where now we see with all these celebrities that gained notoriety and gained all these positions of fame, gained that because they were used as, their sexuality was used as a tool, as a means for them to gain certain positions. Now we see directors and people of high power, having to step down from their role and end up in prison ultimately because, again, women's rights were not adhered to. Yet these same countries we talk about are the ones who are policing in the Middle East and other countries women's rights and advocating for women's rights. And then you look at their societies are hypersexualized, sex sells, and women's are seen as objects and means to get in what they desire. So for me, I feel that these media corporations have kind of conceded. And again, I feel if you were to take articles and put them up against each other, they've shot themselves in the foot. And then saying what you're saying on the international scene, people should now be more aware that, hang on, they're lying to us about this. They're pushing these things that are inconsistent and against the Australian culture. There's something else cooking in the background.
Yeah, well, there's also something you reminded me, talking about the international aspect of things, which is, just a lot of the way I think these days. But here is a system that we live in here, a culture that we live in that has these sorts of cover-ups going on. But as they engage in their wars, they will use gender as a tool to propagandize these sorts of wars. Look at the propaganda against Iran, for example. Now, derivative of US politics, once again, we have these campaigns run by the local chapter of Amnesty International, for example, which is heavily embedded with the US state these days, to say, look at these poor women, they are being jailed because they spoke out against the hijab or something like this. Now, the issue of the hijab is certainly an issue in Iran, and Iranian women have, engaged with it and in fact removed it from the list of infractions a few years ago, and they've got their own struggle going on there. One thing you should say about Iran is that they increased massively the education of women in Iran since the revolution. And what that means is the key factor of empowerment of women is education. They can speak for themselves, they advocate for themselves. But here is this shallow propaganda campaign, mendacious because they lie about it. They say that this British Iranian woman was, just a tourist and speaking out against the hijab, but really, no, she was working for BBC Persian and she covered it up, and actually they were involved in operations linked to the state. We've got the Australian British woman, Kylie Moore Gilbert, who they hid while she was in jail that she'd become an Israeli. She'd done military and leadership training in Israel. And then the media gang up together to say, oh, here's this young, innocent, attractive woman who was, brutalized by the Iranians, covering up her link to Israel until she was released, when they said, oh, well, she just had an Israeli husband or ex-husband or whatever. Covering that up until today, claiming that Iran had said nothing about it, which is entirely false, that Iran has put out a video on the case showing what they accused her of, that she was acting on behalf of the Israeli state. And the fact that agents of the Israeli state, of course, in their collectivity, had been contributing to the assassination of scientists, the terrorist acts committed by MEK and Daesh terrorists in Iran. That the Iranians have some very serious reasons to be concerned about agents of Israel operating in Iran and collecting all sorts of information that are passed back to their enemies for these sorts of crimes, basically. But the media will say, here's a young woman who, was just, oppressed by the anti-woman Iranian regime. They don't care about Iranian women at all. They wouldn't care what Iranian women think. They just pick out a few Western characters and pretend that, and they have, the US has its own, anti-hijab campaign run from the US. No, that doesn't work. If the hijab is going to be removed, or while it's being removed as a requirement, let's say, from young women in Iran, it will be women in Iran that do it. It won't be people in the US who are conscripted into a aggressive propaganda campaign, including terrorist actions against Iran to liberate women in Iran. That's ridiculous. They used the pretext of the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan to maintain the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan. Everyone knows it's a fake, but it seemed like a good idea at the time after they'd invaded it, trashed the country, killed hundreds of thousands of people. And by the way, I was reading today an article about the casualties of the 7 wars that the US has driven in the last 2 decades in the Middle East. And the more conservative version from Brown University was something over 2 million, but another version has it between 5 and 7 million people killed in the last 20 years by these US-driven wars. And here's the US trying to say they're the champion of human rights and women's and girls' rights and so on, when they are the worst of all criminals of the 21st century, and the crimes they've inflicted on women in the Arab and Muslim countries are extraordinary and extensive, and are suppressed every day by this media, which then presents itself as the hero or the protector of some young woman who has been in this unusual situation of being covered up by a minister's office, and so the issue comes to light because it's not simply another run-of-the-mill date rape case. It involves government ministers and so on. But look at the cynicism of these human rights run largely by the media, but also by the governments, and often using women and their idea of women's rights, women's and girls' rights, to run these sorts of wars. It's really one of the most distinctive and most shocking features of war in the 21st century is the conscription of fake human rights pretexts to run the next war. And of course, we see them happening with China now too. We see the propaganda about the so-called suppression of Uyghur Muslims in Western China, when in fact there's something like 2,500 mosques in Xinjiang, and the population of the Uyghurs is increasing, and somehow the problem is Western lefty liberals tend to believe that there's some sort of genocidal campaign against Uyghur Muslims in Western China because of some fake reports that come out of the US, and they don't want to hear the Muslim countries that support China's relationship with their Muslim populations, and the favorable treatment that's given to ethnic minorities, and the steady increase in the population of Uyghur Muslims in Western China. So these pretexts are never ending. If it wasn't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which gave them the false pretext to slaughter hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, including women and children, or the chemical weapons in Syria, which gave them a pretext to keep bombing and slaughtering Syrians in Syria and starve these countries, Lebanon's now included, because Lebanon's economy has been devastated by sanctions as much as anything else, like Syria's, like Iran's, like Iraq's, like the siege on Palestine and Yemen. These are all affecting women as much as anyone else, so let's try and see past or talk around or talk over the heads of this mendacious corporate media that will raise some gender or sexuality issue when it suits its purpose, but will ignore the mass attacks that they are carrying out at the same time on women in their theatres of war.
Yeah, look, I agree. And if you were to look at, let's say, Australian culture, what has Australian culture showed us other than harassment, sexual discrimination, and shunning those who don't drink and adhere to the norm, basically what assimilation was and what colonization wanted? So for me, I feel that the irony of everything you've said, I feel it correlates, and you can use the news that is out currently about these rape allegations that the news are actually providing as a catalyst to show the flaws and the many discrepancies between the narrative that's given and the reality of what actually is happening. Because talk to us about the role that the government is playing in other countries, in sanctions, in harming people's lives, education, COVID, and people's safety. Because when we're talking sanctions in Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen, so on and so forth, we're talking the government is actively participating in war crimes in other countries, and ultimately, women, children, people, innocent civilians are at the hands of our money, our government, and the people that we voted into office.
Well, let's take one example. We've mentioned several countries. Let's get a little bit more specific. In Gaza, in the one part of Palestine, one part of occupied Palestine, there's less than 5% of people have access to clean water. Because Gaza, as we know, is under siege. The whole of Palestine is under siege, but Gaza is under siege in a particularly vicious way, which has denied clean water, clean drinking water to the great bulk of the population, basically. So of course, there's a siege on Yemen, there's a siege on Syria, there's an economy been devastated in Lebanon. The water supply into Syria and Iraq is at times blocked by NATO member Turkey and Mr. Erdogan there playing his part in it. So, of course, who's going to suffer from dirty water, from polluted water? Has our government ever said anything substantial about the Zionist regime in occupied Palestine that is enforcing on behalf of Washington, with our compliance, or the compliance of our government, the siege on Palestine, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the destruction of homes in Palestine? If some young man goes to jail, they'll go and destroy his family home. Who do you think's in there? The mother. This is something that the Australian government is behind completely. If a young Palestinian woman was arrested the other day as she was about to go for graduation at the university because she'd been involved in some student activities which the Zionists said compromised the security of the Israeli state. So instead of graduating, she's in jail. How do you think her health's going to suffer there? There's a COVID epidemic in the Zionist jails at the moment. The Israeli citizens are getting lots of vaccine and the Palestinians are not, and they deny their responsibility as an occupying power to provide equal medical service to the Palestinian population in occupied Palestine. So, our government is firmly behind that. Why would anyone assume for a moment that their declarations about the rule of law, equality before the law, and so on is anything but a smokescreen, basically? So the rights of women, of many millions of women in the 7 theatres of war in the Middle East in the last 2 decades, are under a constant assault by our government, which is following along in the coattails of, as a derivative political culture, as I said, of the US and to a lesser extent of Great Britain. There is no real war that they will not engage in. I mean, let's look at the opportunism of Canberra too when it comes to this. Now, when the nuclear agreement was signed between Iran and the other countries, including the US and the Europeans, but also Russia and China, within a matter of weeks, the then Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, put on a headscarf, went straight to Tehran and started doing business, straight away. There was no hesitation at all. There was no concern about, wearing a hijab or anything like that. By the way, in Iran, most young women wear scarves and they show their hair and so on. It's a little different to in some of the Arab countries. But anyway, there was no problem with doing business, being pragmatic when it came to Iran. When Donald Trump comes along and all of a sudden it's maximum pressure and, new war against Iran, and we'll start assassinating their national heroes, Iraq's national hero and Iran's national hero, the late General Soleimani, Australia's there straight away, the economic war in Iran, fine. Where did that ever get discussed here? Where was it ever considered to be part of an Australian interest? There was plenty of Australian interest in doing normal business, normal relations with Iran in 2015. Along comes 2017 and all of a sudden it all disappears. The same with China. This is why I say we're in a derivative culture. It was not very long ago. In fact, I remember even when I was at school, and that's 50 years ago, that 50 years ago, we were part of Asia. We had to build new relationships with Asia and so on. And and I was at a school where they taught a lot of us Indonesian and said, this is our closest neighbour, our big populous neighbour. We need to develop our relationships, and we'll start studying their language and so on. And then over the years, I think until about a few years ago, when that character Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, he was also in Beijing talking about, Australia's future with China, our biggest trade partner, and so on. Within a matter of a couple of years, all of a sudden, we're sending warships to the South China Sea, where we've got Chinese conspiracies under the bed here. People are new foreign interference laws are being passed, not to say anything about the role of Israeli agents and Israeli money in Australia, but it's all about China all of a sudden because Donald Trump decided to change tack. Maybe if Joe Biden decides that it's the Russians that are the big threat and not the Chinese, and that seems to be a bit of the trend in the US, that somehow or other the two big parties have got two different bogeymans, maybe all of a sudden we'll go softer on the Chinese, and that'll be easier because we sell more stuff to them. And all of a sudden the Russians will be the bogeymans all over again. Which way is Canberra going to jump? It's unpredictable because they really are not making independent, integral decisions here, and meantime, people go along with it. I mean, is this derivative political culture crippling our brains as thinking individuals, as thinking Australian citizens on the ground level? Do people really think about these things? Apparently, the Trump regime managed to whip up a lot of anti-Chinese feeling in the US in the years that he was there. Maybe the Morrison regime here is doing the same anti-Chinese, but are we all going to turn around next week and all of a sudden be anti-Russian? I think actually that was foreshadowed a little bit. Apparently one of the security chiefs recently said that they had detected some agents and they weren't from East Asia in Australia. So maybe the groundwork is being prepared for, the new bogeyman, to have, we'll start arresting Russian citizens instead of Chinese citizens, who are supposedly trying to influence the things by expressing some different opinion. Remember, they arrested a Lebanese Australian member of parliament they didn't arrest him. They raided his house, gave the impression that he was arrested, gave the impression that he was charged. This is Mr. Shaukat Mosulmani. They never charged him with any offence. They told him from the beginning that he wasn't even a suspect in their investigation. But the media pressure was such that the Labor Party kicked him out of the Labor Party because they were so worried about the perceptions there. The Labor Party was so spineless, so gutless, that they kicked out one of their loyal members. Even though he hadn't been charged with anything, he wasn't even under investigation for a particular offence. We're talking about the so-called foreign interference laws here, the new Morrison regime foreign interference laws, partisan foreign interference laws, because they're under control of in this case, Christian Porter, the Attorney General's Department. Remember Christian Porter? And targeted at a particular foreign government, but also the many hundreds of thousands of citizens who feel some affinity to China, or if it was an Arab country, we had the same sort of thing. All of a sudden, maybe we're targeting the Lebanese community, or maybe we're going to target the Russian community. Who knows? This is what those partisan foreign interference laws are going to be targeted at. Not, as one think tank pointed out 3 years ago, that it was the Israeli lobby that was giving more free trips to Australian MPs to go to occupied Palestine, more than the Chinese government, more than even the US government, to have free junkets to go to China or the US. But they singled out Shaukat as a Lebanese Australian MP because he was anti-Zionist, because he was pro-Palestine. He wasn't the only one who was travelling to China. What was his name? Dave Sharma, the Liberal MP who used to be ambassador to Israel. He was, at the beginning of last year, 2020, he was about to go on a Chinese government expenses paid trip to China. Did they go for him and raid his house and scare his kids and bring sniffer dogs into his house? No, it was Mr. Mosulmani, who had paid for his own trips to China, who was deeply involved in Australian ethnic communities and the Chinese community. So you see, this type of arbitrary partisan intervention based on a derivative culture which loyal to the worst criminals on earth. I say that advisedly because there's no doubt that the new Middle East wars of the 21st century, the 7 wars that have slaughtered several million people, is certainly the worst war crime of this century. And our government's involved in it, and our government's covering up many serious crimes, the ones exposed in Afghanistan, the crimes in Iraq, which I've published about, the Australian officer who led the twin assaults on Fallujah in 2004, which killed many civilians with white phosphorus used in a city, for example. The Australian Air Force, following the orders of, but integrated deeply with the US Air Force in attacking Syrian soldiers in Syria when they had no invitation whatsoever to be in Syria. They claimed they were there to fight ISIS. So the web of lies has normalized, first of all, the idea of war. And because these are undeclared dirty wars, it's deepened and normalized the culture of cover-up, I would say. That's why I said at the beginning that this is a deep culture of cover-up and serious crimes committed by these governments, which the corporate media, which now revels in the sexual assault claims because they're about individuals and they don't really threaten their system so much. This same corporate media is involved in distracting us from those very serious crimes. So we can't take too seriously the causes that they champion and keep placing on their front pages.
Yeah, look, I see that, and I do see the inconsistencies and the discrepancies between what they say and what actually really happens. And the saddest thing is, because as Australians and people who live in this country, they don't see past what benefits us, because even the relationship with China, the Morrison government, again, wanted to head the investigation for the origins of coronavirus, which was obviously a puppet move from America, which upset the Chinese, which in turn affected the agriculture, affected the meat industry. Your old place in the university suffered majorly because of the Chinese backing and the students that weren't coming back and the funds that were taken. Tourism takes a hit from China. So these things are disregarded to fight other people's wars. And it seems like the Australian people are the ones that are not benefiting, and their interests are not at all in place with policies that, I don't know, are bigger than the system, I guess.
Well, a lot of them don't see it either. And there's the problem of the media that I mentioned at the end there, that really they're not understanding the implications of these sorts of things. They don't even, let's say, see past the propaganda against China now. They see, the idea that China is an aggressor. This is a propaganda line from the US. China is the aggressor. No, China didn't start the economic war with the US. Trump brought that out into the open because the US companies are very jealous of the rise of the Chinese economy, and that the Chinese economy is, if not the leader of the world now, the leader of the world in a very short space of time. And I don't just mean the economy, I mean technologically speaking. This is why they're so upset about Huawei. Probably in terms of global currency, it's likely, I think, that the Chinese are going to launch an international digital currency, which will start to replace the US dollar. So the US sees a lot of threats by the rise of China there. And, this is, as I said, it's not clear yet whether the Biden regime will depart from that process started by Trump. In many respects, the Biden regime has maintained a continuity with Trump. After all, Biden was vice president when they did the nuclear deal with Iran. But there's too much pride or whatever in where the US is now to go back and say, we'll abandon all the things that Trump did and we'll go back to square one and agree to the nuclear deal with Iran. They can't do that. So they've snookered themselves. They put themselves in a corner where Iran has the high moral ground when it comes to the nuclear agreement. And all they've got to do is say, we held up our part of the deal for as long as we could. If you want to start it again, you go back and agree to what you wrote in 2015, but they can't do that. Unfortunately, the same with Venezuela. They waged an economic war against Venezuela. They damaged the relations that Obama had patched up a little bit with Cuba back in 2014. So they're waging this type of war against independent states in Latin America, in other continents too. Let's remember, particularly in Latin America, with Venezuela and with Cuba. Trump took that backwards. Biden's not able to go back to where his government was a few years before. So, that situation is in difficulty, and people are suffering, like in Venezuela, which wasn't as self-sufficient in medicines, for example, as even Cuba. They were importing insulin for their diabetics. So what happens? They were importing it. They had the money to pay for it. They had oil money to pay for it. All of a sudden, the US cuts off the oil imports from Venezuela, announces these unilateral coercive measures, which is a better phrase than sanctions, because sanctions sounds like it's a bit judicious or something. They're just coercive measures trying to force some political change and hurt people deliberately. But when you do that sort of thing to a country like Venezuela, you have hundreds of thousands of people that are dependent on imported insulin for their diabetes. You've immediately chopped off the source of something that's life-saving to them, basically. Now, Iran's a big country, it produces its own insulin, but Venezuela was more dependent on imported stuff. So this economic war is extremely serious. It's causing the death of many, many people. We know our attention has only been drawn in recent times to the impact of that on Yemen, for example, where there are people starving and where the Australians are still selling weapons to the Emirates and to the Saudis. You mentioned my old university, the University of Sydney. The Chancellor is head of a big arms company called Thales. It's a subsidiary of a French company that sells weapons to the Saudis and the Emirates. The public university, the oldest public university in Australia, its head is an arms dealer who is making money out of these wars in the Middle East. So our system is very deeply compromised when it comes to these sorts of wars. And so, something worth reflecting on when we see the false idealism that comes out of the leaders of the Australian oligarchic culture.
Yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, we started with the Morrison and the rape allegation and what's the culture, Australian culture in Parliament. And we've really unraveled a lot of the war crimes that Australia are covering up and the continuous lies and deceit, because at the end of the day, the corporations are absolutely deceiving the people, and the laymen are not aware of what we just mentioned, Tim?
Yeah, I think that's the point you made in your other question too, or the one that I started off trying to answer when I distracted myself. But I mean, we don't have a decent media here. We need to have spaces for decent discussions, independent discussions, but they are frozen out because they will, of course, try and shut down voices that are uncomfortable to them. So it's important what you're doing, Abbas, and just having a space to talk about these issues more independently. And people respond to that. If there were those sorts of spaces opened up, you see, by the way, when in Latin America, for example, when they create Telesur and they get a lot of conventionally trained journalists are suddenly in an environment which is different to working in the corporate media. And some of those young journalists rise to the opportunity. They're happy to speak more freely, more openly, to criticize things they would not be able to criticize if they were working for CNN or here, the ABC or whatever it is, Even to an extent, I suppose that happened with Al Jazeera, in the sense that Qatar was recruiting, BBC journalists to make it look like, the training and the image and the accents of the British media without the British government propaganda. But unfortunately, in the case of Al Jazeera, they substituted the Qatari foreign policy priorities there. But young journalists do respond to the opening up of new opportunities, and unfortunately, those sort of opportunities have been shut down by the sort of media we have here. We've got, of course, it's been something virtually my whole life that the Murdoch media has controlled huge sections of the Australian media. And to his credit, the former Labor leader Kevin Rudd tried to make an issue out of that. I think maybe it's dying now, but it was very important to to raise that question of how is it that our media is so uniquely bad. There aren't really debates on these big important issues. It's only peripheral things, or things that are seen as abnormal, or crimes, or salacious sort of crimes, sexual assault, which can grab their attention, but they will always steer away from their hard issues. Always steer away from the hard issues. There is not really a decent culture of journalism in this country, and it's a sad thing. And unfortunately, it has its impact on the way people think and talk about things. I mean, I think it was Marshall McLuhan, the US analyst, who said in the 60s, the power of the mass media was not that they told people what to think, The power was that they told them what to think about. So if everyone is thinking about China, or some sexual assault, or, wasn't it terrible, or some car crash, they will dictate those sorts of terms. And it is much more difficult to have wider discussions about things that you and I might think are more important.
Yeah, and that's important. I think that's what this platform's all about. And I feel everyone has a voice and everyone has a reach, and people should be doing and engaging in conversations like we are now. And another international incident that's happened, or a new law that's passed in France, has me baffled, and I'd like to get your opinion on this. So in France, as of July 2021, halal and kosher slaughter of animals will be banned. And this is a big backlash because there's a lot of Muslim communities in both countries. And further, the thing that has me baffled more so is a French prime minister, when push comes to shove, for any chance he gets to go into the Middle East, countries like Lebanon, for example, he's willing every time and time again himself to come with his government to come and solve the problem, when it seems like he's not really interested in the Arab people.
Yeah, there's a particular history to that, as you point out, both in relation to Lebanon and Syria, with France's former colonial status, and in North Africa, of course, where, there was a big war of independence in Algeria against the French. And that in turn has large migrant communities from North Africa, and to some extent from the Middle East in France, including, an Iranian community in France and so on. So you're right, there's very big Arab and Muslim populations in France, and it's unclear to me, I don't know the origins, the history of this particular proposal, but it seems a remarkably inflammatory sort of thing to be doing when literally millions of the French people are of Muslim background, and this is an important issue to them. Me as a vegetarian,
and we have the Jewish as well. We've got the kosher.
Well, that's right. They probably got a much smaller Jewish population, but they won't have the same issues there. So, but of course, you see, even during that time when the current French President Macron, who, as you pointed out, swanned into Lebanon as some sort of savior to try and solve the problems of the Lebanese people, which he himself had been involved in inflicting, because France, as you know, with Britain, is closely tied into the US. 3 permanent members of the Security Council that have effectively destroyed the UN Security Council in its primary mandate, which was to prevent war. The Security Council has not been able to prevent any of the wars of the last 20 years in the Middle East, because 3 of its 5 permanent members have been involved in pushing those aggressive wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so on, Palestine, Yemen. But so meanwhile, at home, there have been huge demonstrations. You see the yellow vests in France. They kept on the streets for the best part of a year. Maybe the whole COVID situation drove them off the streets, because France also got hit by a very big epidemic there. But for many, many months, there were daily protests on the streets against the neoliberal regime imposed by Macron, who's widely seen as a puppet of the banking system, by the way, a transnational banking system, and apparently a system which can introduce these sort of rather arbitrary sounding policies, which are going to, of course, create a huge backlash with a very large portion of the French population, and not really care about it, because the media, which is linked to the same oligarchy, is going to say, look somewhere else, look at Hezbollah in Lebanon or something like that. Look at the protests in Lebanon. The protests must be against the resistance to Israel in Lebanon, and not look at the yellow vest protests, which carried on for months and months against the Macron regime. So it's extraordinary that the French administration can really be so blasé, disregard the sensitivities of their own population, So I don't really understand why it is that they would have allowed it. I mean, it sounds like it's come from some sort of reactionary, racist sort of discourse against French Muslims, but it's going to blow up in their face, really, if they carry through with something like that, something that's very important from a religious point of view.
Yeah, because religious freedom comes under, scrutiny once again, because I think France has made a history of not really considering the different denominations. And to see, like, on another grand scheme, we see the Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Sistani and Pope Francis of the Roman Catholic Church coming together to try and build peace, unity, and justice in the world, as well as accountability to the Zionist state. And the Ayatollah did ask for a more proactive front for the Palestinians against the oppression that they're facing. And the French people continuously disregard that. Yet when it's time for them, or when it suits them to have interest in the region, like you said, they're the first to come on the plane, and they got a whole plan, and they're revising a plan and ready to come back and to exercise it and be on the ground once again.
Yeah, look, I read about that. It was a respectful meeting between Pope Francis and Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, and maybe it was long delayed because, of course, one of the impacts of the war in the long-term war and occupation of Iraq has been, of course, the near expulsion of a large part of the Christian community from Iraq, basically. It's happened to a lesser extent in Syria because Syria has resisted that occupation and has had much, only, let's say, a marginal occupation, but certainly there was a lot of pressure on Christian communities in Aleppo. But what I think I have to say, unfortunately, is that the church authorities, and this is not just the Catholic Church, but a range of churches, they may have spoken about peace in these wars, but they didn't really target their own government's role in the aggression there. It wasn't Iraq or Syria that was attacking France or Britain or the US. It was France and Britain and the US that were invading Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and giving comfort to the Zionist regime in occupied Palestine. So where were the Christian voices? Of course, there were some at the ground level, there's no doubt about that, but at the high levels of the hierarchy of the Christian churches, we heard a lot of feeble expressions about peace and anti-war and so on, but not really saying to where they might have influence in their own regimes, in their own countries, let's say, to denounce the war of their carried on by the states in which they enjoyed a privileged status. Of course, you surmise precisely because they enjoy that privileged status, but precisely because they shut up when it comes to the inconvenient actions of the states in which they exist. So I applaud the Pope Francis for going to Iraq and talking to Ayatollah Sistani, but I don't really think the Vatican has played much of a role in trying to contain this aggression against so many countries that have come under attack in the last 20 years in the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's why Said Sistani, in their conversation, the pretext that I did read and catch, he did say for 10 years you haven't sent a representative, and we need to be more proactive on this front because we need to take it on together, and it can't be really from one side, because there have been representatives that have been to the Vatican, and there has been dialogue and back and forth, which there has to be, because it's very important in the region, and it's very important to ensure that peace and unity and coexistence happens in the world. So I do feel that was, unprecedented, and it was a event that had to have happened. And hopefully we can see more actions after that, because there's a lot of tension in the region, and it needs a lot of people to come together.
Yeah, look, no, I agree with your sentiment, but at the risk of being, a sort of raining on hopeful news, let me point this out. There are a number of representatives in uh, the French state, let's say, in the church, the French church, let's say, who have actively campaigned against uh, those that support Syria, those that support a resistant Lebanon, actively campaigned against it, undermined members of their own church. For example, I know there's a very prominent nun, Mother Agnes Mariam, who's actually Lebanese but spent a lot of time in Syria, who was undermined by high church representatives in France, in the Vatican. And then we have the role of the Maronite Patriarch in Lebanon, who is involved actively in supporting the Jaja faction, in small minority faction in Lebanese politics, against the progressive bloc that's effectively been in government for recent years there. So there is and that has to be under the influence of also the French archbishops, the French hierarchy of the church, which has a strong relationship to the Maronite, the Orthodox the Maronite Patriarch in Lebanon. So while you may see some hopeful signs there, and it came out of the visit by Pope Francis, there is this constant undercurrent from church hierarchies in Europe and France in particular, because of course these people are embedded with French intelligence and the French state. Basically, it's not like they are doing something independently of what Macron is doing there. The hierarchy of the French Catholic Church has a very close relationship with the French state and the French intelligence. And when the French state is effectively in an undeclared war with a number of Middle East countries, including Palestine, then the church gets involved in these undercover undermining campaigns against members of their own church who are siding with the resistance to the invasions and the dirty wars and the neo-colonial relationships there. So there is a constant battle going on at that level, and we don't see it really, but the people who are actually more at a ground level involved in the anti-war, anti-imperialism side of the church at a grassroots level, they're feeling that impact.
So then my question would be, then why, when it comes to sitting on the table, the EU, Europe, France in particular, I'm going to ask, why when the nuclear deal with Iran came to the table, they didn't have that, how would I say, that resistance that America had. So they were more inclined to sit and to adhere to what the nuclear deal was. How does that come? Because if you look at countries like Iraq and all the proxies, like you look at Syria and Lebanon and all the forces that are joined together and fighting ISIS and fighting terrorism, why is France willing to go and fulfill their nuclear deal rights with Iran then?
Right. Why is there a division between the US position on the nuclear deal and that of the Europeans? Although you may have noticed that it's true that there has been a division or a difference, let's say, not that they've actually acted on it much. Iran has criticized them. The Iranian government has criticized the French and the British in particular for not acting to normalize economic relationships with Iran when they didn't agree with the Trump position of tearing up the treaty and walking away and reimposing some coercive measures. Basically, in the first instance, they verbally opposed it because they weren't easily initially persuaded to the Trump line on this. But they didn't really have the will or the capacity to act on it, because if you remember, the Trump regime, and actually the Washington regime generally, the US Treasury, and in particular its Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, which is the one that enforces these so-called sanctions on dozens of countries would come in against them. I did a little bit of research, and it's in one of the chapters of my book, Axis of Resistance, that in the history of sanctions against Cuba and Iran, for example, it was the Obama administration that started to attack European banks. And it hadn't happened under the George W. Bush regime, but when Obama came into power, the type of sanctions that they had against Cuba, for example, which used to be they'd find some US tourists coming back from Cuba with some Cuban cigars, which, you know, the US were the biggest consumers of Cuban cigars, and they'd fine them $1,000 or something. Or, I mean, it hurts the individual, those sort of fines, but they weren't big things. When the Obama regime comes in, they stop doing that stuff and they turn to the French banks, which they know are doing, not the French banks, the European banks, the French and the European banks, which are doing business with Iran and Cuba indirectly. They find they're breaching US sanctions, not breaching US law or French law, but US sanctions. And the US considers if any corporation has 10% or more US-based shareholdings, they can regard it as a US company and impose fines. Now, these are not really normal legal fines, but they are effectively a type of blackmail, which means that the US diplomats will say, you either pay this US Treasury fine, or, you know, you can go on doing business with Iran and Cuba and forget about your business in the US. And of course, the business in the US is worth a lot more to those sorts of companies, and particularly the banks. And through the 90s, there was a whole series of mergers and acquisitions where French companies and British companies and US companies are involved in takeovers and mergers, and they're really very, very close, particularly the finance ones, you know. So through the course of the Obama administration, I calculated there was at least $5 billion in fines to mainly European banks because they had facilitated business with Iran and Cuba in particular, a couple of other little countries, but mainly Iran and Cuba. So in that sort of background, you see that there's, and Australian banks for that matter too, the ANZ and the NAB were also fined by the US Treasury for facilitating some sort of transactions with Cuban entities, you know, even though the Europeans weren't involved in that one, but the NAB and the ANZ and all of the private Australian banks, minus the credit unions, which aren't banks in that sense, they all have a large number of US shareholdings, basically. So the US considers them as its subject. It can impose these sort of fines, basically. So in that context, the big European companies didn't feel able to just do normal business with Iran when the US had pulled out, because the US could take revenge on them and impose those sort of sanctions. So at a sort of corporate level, that's why the Europeans couldn't do it. And even though the French and the British governments were saying, well, you know, we actually want to keep this agreement because it was a bad agreement anyway. It was a bad deal for Iran. Iran only got into it because it wasn't just the Europeans and the US. Russia and China were involved in this agreement. Now, how Russia and China wanted to force unilateral disarmament against Iran and not any other country in the region, you know, the proposal had been around for a nuclear-free Middle East. What about Israel, which has nuclear weapons? You know, that's left out of the picture. We'll just focus on Iran, they said. And somehow or other, the Washington had an advantage then, which it does not have now, that it had the backing not just of the big Europeans, but of Russia and China. So when Iran signed that deal in 2015, it was under that sort of pressure. Now, what's happened now? Russia and China have changed their position entirely in relation to Iran. The Europeans didn't like it, but they weren't able to oppose the sanctions. And then in the end, you found Macron, although you're right in saying there was a division between the French, for example, and the US, in the end, Macron has been saying in recent times, or despite claiming that he's, you know, an independent voice and wants to reclaim France's independent role and so on and so on, he has been saying, echoing what Trump said, oh, now we've got to put Iran's missiles back into the deal. We've got to put these new things. We've got to include the Saudis as a part, can you believe it? The Saudis as a partner in the JCPOA. And we'll have a totally new JCPOA. So Macron came around to repeating the Trump line effectively, you know. Meanwhile, Iran sits back and said, no, we have a deal. We complied as long as we could. Nothing new. If there's anything new, it's going to advantage us, the Iranian leader said recently, not you. because the circumstances are more in our favor these days, basically. So in other words, if anyone's going to rip up this deal or bury it, it's going to be the opponents of Iran, not Iran, basically, because Iran it's true, they're steadily withdrawing from the agreement, as they're entitled to if the other side doesn't keep up its deal. And there's a bit of propaganda from more than a bit of propaganda from the US side, for example, about Iran not complying. But everyone who's serious knows that Iran was virtually the only one that complied and didn't get any of the benefits. The only benefits in the deal for them was that they would lift the sanctions, and they didn't lift the sanctions, they worsened them. So they don't take the Europeans seriously. And by the way, it's a very good indicator that the Europeans' word is not worth very much, because if the US jumped the other way, the France and Britain and Germany simply were not able, they're not capable of saying, they created a mechanism, by the way, they created a mechanism a payment system to try and do business with Iran or any other country, Cuba, for example, without going through the US SWIFT system, avoiding the US surveillance of transactions, which is based in Europe but controlled by the US because it's through the US dollar and one thing and another. And therein lies, the fact that a lot of the big countries now, like Russia and China, are avoiding the US dollar in international trade, and the US dollar is in decline as a feature there. But yeah, the Europeans can't be taken seriously as an independent player, because with the JCPOA they were shown to not like what the Trump regime was doing, but not able to act independently of it there. And therein, why would Iran take them seriously anymore, let alone the US, which signed a deal and then ripped it up, within a year or so. Iran, of course, can't take the words from the US seriously, but they can't take the European leaders, or the French and the British and the German leaders, seriously, because they protested but then did nothing.
Yeah,
So what happened to their political independence,
it's interesting how things play out, and time shows all. And then you get to see the big players, the discrepancies, the hypocrisy from people, and the double standards that continuously happens on the international stage. Talking about all that, what's going on with the Israeli election? Geez, I think how many more times do they want to revote and take it there? We're at the exit poll. Netanyahu's looking at a draw. I thought he lost about 10 times.
They kept having elections till he stayed where he was, basically. I mean, he's been there longer than any Zionist leader. I think he was prime minister earlier on, then he's been there since 2009, despite corruption charges, despite the fact that a very small percentage of the Jewish Israeli population votes for his party. But somehow they put together a coalition of parties, bringing in some of his rivals and so on. But virtually all of whom are ugly apartheid proponents, effectively. They marginalised the Palestinian reps in that parliament, that Knesset, for example. One of them just got released from jail because he was providing some mobile phones to prisoners, and they accused him of supporting terrorism, one thing and another. So the elections, really, I think it's right that people don't pay much attention to them, really, because this is, as an increasing number of reports have confirmed, an apartheid state, which has no business existing in the contemporary world. There's been some very good reports, including from Israeli organizations in recent times, confirming that what is happening in occupied Palestine is, in fact, apartheid. And apartheid, as international law has said for a number of years, is a crime against humanity, and the international community as a collective has a responsibility to dismantle that apartheid system. So, elections held under that sort of system really have no more legitimacy than the elections that were held under white South Africa, effectively, because they weren't showing anything other than the contradictions within that system. Even, I would say that what's more interesting these days is the other large Jewish community in the world is in the US, in New York and New Jersey in particular. Their steady alienation from the Netanyahu regime, because the Jewish American community see themselves as rather liberal, progressive, tolerant sort of people, and their position has been for some time that they hate Netanyahu, but they like they maintain this illusion of a nicer, friendlier Israel that will still exist, you know. And I think there's a great deal of disillusionment coming into that community, so that you see actually some of the better critiques in recent times. I don't mean just sort of liberal critiques, you know, criticizing Netanyahu, but actually critiques of the system. And even in these Israeli organizations, which have denounced the Israeli system as an apartheid system. So even within the colony itself, you have significant uh, Jewish Israeli opposition now to the maintenance of this a state for the Jews as opposed to a democratic state. You know, that old illusion that people said that Israel was the only democracy in the Middle East, or that sort of thing, you know. And is still to this day considered a part of Europe. You know, they're in Eurovision, they're in European soccer. How they're in the European soccer leagues, I don't know. How they're in Eurovision, I don't know. On the one hand, they claim they're original Levantines, they're from the Levant, but even the Jewish historians are saying no, actually they're European, their mothers were European going back thousands of years and so on. So the myths of that apartheid regime, let's not forget, there's a great deal of exposure going on at the level of some progressive Jews, including progressive academic Jews, exploding these sorts of myths there. The contradictions of that system are causing a lot of friction within what they considered their constituency for the last 73 years.
Yeah, look, I just don't really watch it, and I don't see him as a state. I do see him as an apartheid state as well. I just want to see Netanyahu eventually answer for his war crimes. I feel that, you know, as soon as this bloody mess of a so-called election is over, the something in me is just waiting to see, is he going to ever answer? Because I do share the sentiment that you do, but even if we look at the Palestinians, the United Nations have them as an observing state, and even then there's an uproar as to why they even have a seat there. And, you know, apartheid is apartheid, and until the Israeli state is not recognized as a state, and they're not in Europe, and they're not, you know, getting all these royalties, and they're not calling the shots, because boy, are they calling most of the shots that's happening. If you're to look at the war in Yemen, can you look past, Israel? Can you look past the UAE? The UAE and Saudi Arabia are only as strong as they are is because of the relationship they have with Israel. You know, and in some sense of the imagination, America is a puppet to the Zionist regime. And that was seen with in Iraq. If you look at the work and the General Haj Qasem Soleimani, the martyr, that was a mission he was on, like the Iraqis have said, between reconciling, but in the region of Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Whose interest was that against?
Yeah, look, you're right about the increasing role of Israel. I think actually at the propaganda level and at the war level, there is this increasing role of Israel in the wider region. I mean, outside occupied Palestine, you know, we know there's been hundreds of attacks on Syria, which the Syrians have up till now largely tolerated because they're fighting on several fronts at once, and they're a small state and they can't carry out several major wars at once, but they're pushing the boundaries there. Clearly they're intervening when there is successes by the Syrian army and their allies, basically. They have been attacking Iraqis. You're right, both in Iraq and in eastern Syria. Their role with the US, and this is where I disagree with you a bit. I don't really think the Zionist tail is wagging the imperial dog. I think the Zionist tail is a Zionist tail on the imperial dog. And they're anxious, they're worried, of course, that the imperial dog may regard them as less important in the future. Because, of course, this is the problem of foreign intervention by big powers. If the big power is always there, there is no incentive for the local agents to talk to their neighbours. They said this about in the north of Ireland, you know. Why would the loyalists in the north of Ireland talk to their Irish neighbours when the British Army was on their side, ready to intervene. You know, the same thing. Why would the Israeli, or let's say the Jewish Israelis in occupied Palestine, talk seriously to their neighbours when they simply say, we've got a big stick and we've got a big brother behind us that's going to back us up? Why would they threaten Iran with war? Iran, which is a far bigger country, far more capable country, with war, if they didn't think that the US was going to back them up? And that's a gamble. That's a gamble now, because what if this is what destabilizes them? Even though, as you say, they become more involved in the terrorism against Iraq, they are um, mounting a direct presence in the Gulf. You're right, with the Emiratis, potentially with Bahrain. They are intervening directly in Yemen. They have some proxies on Socotra Island because they want to try and get the strategic advantage that Yemen has at the entrance to the Red Sea there. So they are increasingly desperate, and they are worried, for example, that the Biden administration might say, well, we're going to cut a deal with Iran here. You know, the US has never been prepared to go to war with Iran. They'd like others to do it for them. They parked the MEK terrorists in Albania, and, you know, they fund them to carry out operations against Iran. They've moved Daesh across to Afghanistan so that they can have a destabilization force there. You know, they've infiltrated them into some of the northern and southern parts of Iraq to carry out terrorist operations there. But the US does not want a direct confrontation with Iran, because Iran is the biggest independent country in the region, and that's why they obsess so badly about it. And the Israelis only provoke Iran because they think, they bet on counting on the hope that if there is a major response by resistance forces, Iran combined with Syria, combined with Hezbollah, for example, on the borders of occupied Palestine, that the US will come and rescue them, because they haven't got a hope by themselves, basically. But they are anxious that they might be abandoned. This anxiety drives a high degree of, rhetoric and shrill talk about, supposed Iranian nuclear weapons and so on. They, in a sense, had a victory with the nuclear deal starting off in the early part of this century, but that's all changed, basically. So Israel, as an entity, I agree with you that it has no future. But what is happening, in the short term, is that there is this increasing direct intervention and levels of propaganda. And of course, they're very concerned about the international propaganda too. That's why they went all out to try and undermine the Corbyn-led British Labour government. After all, Britain was the mother of the Israeli colony in Palestine, and that was later adopted by the North Americans, but they were very concerned about the propaganda, the damaging morale impact of a British Labour government that might have been quite pro-Palestinian. They were very concerned about that, basically. And the smartest amongst them know that this spectre of apartheid, which you and I understand, but out there in the wider corporate media world, there is still this illusion that there is some sort of two-state possibility there. Unfortunately, I think the Palestinian Authority helps perpetuate that, really. But the smarter Israeli leaders have admitted, they said, as soon as this idea of two states disappear, we are lost, because it will become an anti-apartheid campaign, and we can't win that. We can't win if there is a unified Palestinian response and their supporters internationally to the idea of a one democratic state and to dismantle apartheid. But the main obstacle there, the two-state illusion. And that's why I think the Trump administration in its last days tried to resurrect that. You might recall they were trying to say, after the so-called Kushner plan, which didn't mention a Palestinian state, the Trump regime about a year ago said, look, there's still a possibility of a Palestinian state. even if Netanyahu was saying nothing about it, by these little pockets of the West Bank, which was still designated Zone A under the Israeli occupation. They've got Zone A, Zone B, Zone C, and so on. So this is a set of contradictions which, and you mentioned wanting to see Netanyahu prosecuted. I think it's a positive sign that the ICC, for all its bad history, has decided to, it has jurisdiction and can investigate the crimes of the Israeli state, even though they say they're also investigating the possible crimes of the Palestinian resistance, even though the ICC's history is only to prosecute African leaders. They haven't prosecuted one Western or NATO leader for all of the wars of the Middle East of the last 20 years. And it's not a coincidence. It's because that those big powers, and particularly Britain, France, and the US, have this inordinate influence in the UN system. But nevertheless, the fact that at least since the status of Palestine reached a certain level in the UN system where they felt that even though Israel as a state wasn't a party to the ICC, to the Statute of Rome, Palestine was. Palestine as some sort of quasi-state was, and therefore they could investigate, for example, the huge massacres in Gaza, for example, and that has put the Zionist regime on the back foot too. They are very upset, and similarly their supporters, the UK, France, and the US are backpedaling, trying to pretend that they support international law, but oppose this. So it's a good thing, even if there aren't huge prospects of the ICC coming in and arresting Netanyahu and putting him in jail, as they did to the sorry late Mr. Milosevic there, who was acquitted posthumously. Even if those prospects aren't very high, it does raise the stakes in the propaganda war, which Israel takes very seriously, because, as I said, the smartest amongst them know that if this is seen as an anti-apartheid campaign for a single democratic state, in which, by the way, the Arab Palestinian population now outnumbers the Jewish Israeli population, if you look at the whole of occupied Palestine, they've lost. So the ideological war is very important to them, and the ICC is another step in that direction, I think. So in this respect, maybe I'm a little more hopeful than you are there, not necessarily of jailing Netanyahu, but that there is this sort of possible a positive contribution of the ICC's intervention into the mounting contradictions that the European colony in Palestine is facing.
Yeah, look, I do see what you're saying, and I do agree, because when the going gets tough and the pendulum looks to swing the other way, Netanyahu does run off to America, and he does speak in Congress, and he does plead his case as best he can. But the only thing that I felt that Netanyahu got over the American regime was he got Trump to admittedly come out and do his dirty work. And we all know who was really behind the strings pulling there. But then when you look at the context of the greater scheme, they are dependent, and they are really absolutely nothing without the support of America.
Yeah, they get several $1 billion a year from the US. They are crying poor. One of the other contradictions that's opened up is because people with money don't necessarily have power, because they chuck it around, and the Zionist regime has done that, and that's why they are crying poor. They're not providing welfare for young New York Israelis to come over and live on state-funded holidays in Israel with dual citizenship. I mean, they're doing it, but now they want them to pay their own way and join the army and put their lives on the line for whatever, and they're relying on the Chinese to come and fund their infrastructure, and the US is not very happy with that. And the Chinese, of course, and the Russians are smart in this way, that they, in a sense, don't have these sort of absolute bars to dealing with US allies if it means they can get counter leverage with the US, So this is a game that the Russians play with Israel for a range of reasons, but one of them is, why wouldn't they get influence with a regime which is seen to be a creature of the US, basically, and the Chinese the same way, more or less. So the US don't like it in the big picture scheme of things, because they see as diminishing their own influence. That's why the US is their biggest fear is these good relationships developing between East Asia and Europe, you know, that breaking down all those sorts of barriers which the US has been trying to erect in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, and so on. And that's, of course, also in big picture terms why they, you know, some of the better US analysts are now saying, look, they're in Afghanistan for the long haul, because look what Afghanistan does for them. And nothing to do with the Taliban, nothing to do with anything else like that. It's to do with the fact that they are positioned next to Iran. They can keep destabilizing Iran. They are positioned in a place where they can obstruct the Belt and Road extension of China, China's relationship with the Middle East and with Europe. And they've also got access to Uyghur Muslims who, as we know, they've used as Al-Qaeda fodder in Syria. I think there's about 15,000 Uyghur Al-Qaeda fighters in northwest Syria now. That they are, you know, of course, no coincidence that this whole Uyghur Muslim thing has become the new human rights darling of Amnesty International and the US and so on. So in the big picture scheme of things, Israel is not the only game for the US. Israel is their most reliable colony and proxy in the region, followed by the Saudis, and then some of the other Persian Gulf regimes, but the most important ones are Israel and the Saudis. They hoped with their new Middle East wars to be have a region that was dominated by a greater Israel and the Saudis. That's failed. Everyone knows it's failed, but the US is, as some senior military people have said to me when I was in Syria, look, they want to delay that defeat as long as possible. They are causing harm to people because they don't know how to accept that sort of defeat. They may pull back to another line in terms of direct occupation in the region and rely on their proxies there, but Israel is anxious because they do fear this retreat, I believe, by the US that's going to leave them without that sort of guarantee. Do you remember something else that happened under the Bush regime? There was little Georgia, which was and still is pretty much became a sort of an appendage of NATO in foreign policy terms against Russia. But they decided to attack a population that was protected by Russia, and hoping that George Bush would come in and protect them, and they didn't. And so the Russians this was in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, I think. And so the Russians just came in and creamed them, basically, and Bush didn't help Georgia, you know. So that sort of fate is something that the Israelis feel. Now, the Israelis, it's true, have more counter leverage. It's true, they have a stronger history. And as the current president, Joe Biden, said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent one. It's a very good investment we make, putting billions of dollars in there, because it's a center they can use to destabilize that region. It's the core of the destabilization of the region is Israel, basically. But they have some other options, and one of Afghanistan, the Saudis, and so on. It's been suggested that the US might pull its direct occupation out of Syria and Iraq. This was some people in the Trump regime, previous to Biden, but it's coming from the Pentagon and from the deep state, let's say, and let Erdogan, for example, try and colonize parts of Syria and Iraq to weaken Syria and Iraq, pull back to Jordan, let the Saudis do more of what the Saudis do, basically. So I think this is one of the fears of the Zionist regime, that the US is going to pull back. It's going to say, cut another deal with Iran, maybe not this one, maybe some other one there, more or less. And that means that the Israelis can't carry on with this dangerous, provocative threatening of Iran, saying we are killing Syrians, because they're Iranian-backed militia, or whether they're from Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever they're from. They won't be able to carry on with that as they do, because the fact is that Iran has extended its influence in Syria quite strongly, despite the Israeli attacks. And what the Zionist regime fears is, one day when they've got rid of the terrorists in Idlib and the remnants of Daesh and so on, and one day the US is pulled out and the Kurdish proxy falls apart, that the Zionist regime is going to see on the borders of the occupied Golan a very strong Iranian-backed, Lebanese resistance-backed Syrian army ready to reclaim the first part of what is occupied Palestine, occupied Syria there. That's their nightmare, basically. And that is indeed what they're facing when the realities of regional realignment come about, whether that's in 1 year or 5 years, I'm not sure, but it's not going to be 10 years, I don't think.
Tim, pleasure speaking to you. I enjoyed the chat. We started on accountability of these media outlets that aren't really reporting what the real story is. We tore it, we ripped it, we pulled the lid on the story, we took it international, we showed Australia's discrepancies, international law discrepancies on the stories that aren't covered. We got to the bottom of it. Accountability, justice is important. Tim, what would your final message be to people listening to make sure that they, spark something into the viewers to everyone can go out and cause change no matter what people say, and no matter how small your voice is, it has to be reached?
Yeah, I think you're right. The way that you started the summary was to talk about the failures of our media, really. I think that's, in a sense, that was hidden by the culture of covering up sexual assault, but it sort of led us into other international territory, which we kept coming back to the fact that we have a media that actively misleads us every day. It's like a junk food, but more poisonous than a junk food, basically. And we need these alternative channels, these new ways, just so we can think straight, so we can think properly, so we can think correctly and not be constantly diverted into these issues that are, permissible space for us to talk about. We don't need those sort of boundaries set by the corporate media, by the elites. We need to be able to discuss and raise these things openly, and you're providing one channel for that. And there are many possibilities. If we look at the options on the internet, we can create new options, we can tap into new options. They've done it in Latin America, with Telesur. Telesur is a very powerful, mainly Spanish language, it's also in English, but these sort of new media networks. Iran in the Middle East has done an awful lot in many, many languages. I find Hispan TV, although it's in Spanish, is one of the best news services now because it's one of the few that's combining critical issues in the Middle East and in Latin America, So, but there are these sorts of networks. Al Mayadeen is in Arabic and Spanish, English has sort of been left out there, but the Iranians have strong English networks. So we have to identify and find and share those decent alternative networks so people can wean themselves off this junk food that is just destroying our minds.
Yeah, I agree. Look, I take every victory as well. I love when they concede to defeat. I love when they talked about a culture that's hidden, and I just like to keep tearing up at it. I knew no one better than yourself. Thanks for coming on. Honestly, Tim, it's a pleasure. We'll always come to you when this big story is breaking. And honestly, from the podcast, from the viewers, thank you for listening. Guys, Tim Anderson, get on his social medias. He's biggest on Twitter. He also is on Facebook. Anything that I'm missing, Tim?
Very welcome, Abba. Talk anytime.
Champion, mate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.